This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast and author of the Vietnam Weekly newsletter, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. This will be the last episode of the year. Thanks to everyone who has listened over the last 12 months. I'll be back in your podcast feed sometime in January. If everything goes to plan, 2025 may go down as the most consequential year in modern Vietnamese history since Doi Moi began in 1986. There's no such thing as a boring year for Vietnam, but nearly every month brought some new, wildly ambitious, at times unrealistic, it must be said, policy or target. The provincial merger and administrative restructuring, Resolution 68 and its focus on the domestic private sector, reviving nuclear energy, approving the national high-speed rail line, potentially banning gas-powered motorbikes from central Hanoi, ending the state gold monopoly, preparing to launch an international financial center. Any one of these could have been the biggest story in a previous year, yet this all happened in 2025, and I've left out quite a few things. This coincides with what top leaders have hailed as the start of Vietnam's, quote, era of national rise, coinciding with General Secretary To Lam's seemingly limitless rise himself and expansive goals for the country's future. With annual GDP growth humming along, skeptics be damned, and a target of 10% starting next year, a number that Vietnam has never reached before, the leadership has good reason to be confident. Of course, 2025 has brought huge challenges, too. U.S. President Donald Trump's initial tariff of 46% rattled the Vietnamese government, and while the ensuing impact hasn't been as severe as first anticipated, it's clear to many that the U.S. cannot really be trusted, for now at least, or at least as much as some officials here wish. We also witnessed a savage preview of a more unpredictable climate future, with record-smashing flooding causing severe damage and loss of life across a huge swath of the country in October and November. That threat will loom large moving forward, along with other unresolved challenges such as declining birth rates, a badly strained electrical system, wildly inflated housing prices, lingering corruption, and more. Even taking all of that into account, there's a lot to feel positive about when it comes to Vietnam. Next year will be equally critical. Can the many reforms and resolutions of 2025 be implemented as planned? How will the National Congress in January impact this process? If Vietnam wants to hit its laundry list of huge goals, including a national high-speed rail line and 2 nuclear power plants operating within a decade, high-income status by 2045, etc., real progress has to start almost immediately. To discuss just some of these issues, today's guest is Nguyen Khac Giang, a visiting fellow at the Vietnam Studies program of the ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He's a repeat guest and joined me for a similar year-end conversation in 2024. We covered the administrative restructuring and its broad impacts, increasing private sector involvement in the economy and infrastructure, To Lam's foreign policy and the move away from, quote, bamboo diplomacy, the rise of the military and police in the business sectors, and the upcoming party congress. It's impossible to distill an entire year into one podcast episode, of course, but I hope listeners find this illuminating. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Giang. Giang, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
My pleasure. It's great to be back and to discuss. I think it would be very interesting times for observers of Vietnamese politics for the next month or so.
Yeah, absolutely, which we'll get into, obviously. I guess this conversation is maybe now an annual event. I had you on at the end of last year to kind of look back at 2024, which was busy in its own way, with To Lam becoming General Secretary. But this year has been, certainly since I've been paying attention more closely to Vietnamese politics and government, one of the more eventful years I could think of. I mean, I know we were emailing back and forth about some topics, and you said we could probably talk all morning. So I kind of listed out a few things. There's the provincial merger and getting rid of districts, which I know for people not in Vietnam might sound like not the biggest deal, but has been pretty momentous, I think. There's Resolution 68 and several other resolutions kind of aimed at getting the private sector more involved in the economy and spurring more innovation. To Lam's foreign policy, foreign policy as a whole, but To Lam has been taking some pretty interesting foreign trips, which he wrote about recently. There's the U.S. tariffs, Vingroup getting more involved in a lot of sectors, a bunch of other topics I haven't even touched on. But I guess what do you think has been the biggest development of the year?
Well, I think it's really hard, where to begin with. It's just so eventful, and if you look at the way the Vietnamese politics normally functions, is everything changes very slowly and gradually. But this year we have seen so many breakthroughs, and decisive break with previous norms and traditions of how politics is being carried out in Vietnam. So I think if I have to pick one, I would say the bureaucratic reform, including the restructuring of all of those provinces and the ministries, party commissions, is the biggest and potentially most consequential political reform in Vietnam last year, not only because it might have the potential to reshape how political economy in Vietnam is being played out, but it might have very interesting short-term, but also consequential impact on the
Mm.
next party congress in January. So I think that's probably the most important event for me. But obviously, if you look at the pivot to the private sector with private conglomerates, including Bean Group, Sun Group, Taco,
Mm.
becoming the driving force of the economy. I also consider that as very important as well, at least in terms of ideological um, reconsideration of the Vietnamese state. Because when you think about Vietnam, China, and Laos, North Korea as communist states, normally the state sector plays the most important role in the economy. But now with Tolam, issuing the Resolution 68 under the banner of the Politburo, he basically shifts the whole discourse from state-led capitalism to private-led capitalism, which obviously has a lot of implications for first the how the economy will be governed. Second, how the party state can reconcile with the ideological purity of the system. So this is also very very interesting as well. And obviously, I like to say about foreign policy. One interesting fact that I find very interesting is the way that he kind of like reshaped the discourse over Vietnam's foreign policy. So under the 13 years of the late leader Nguyen Phu Trọng, we are very familiar with the concept of bamboo diplomacy.
Hmm.
But if you look at the way that Tolam, despite the fact that he has been, extremely, movable in terms of traveling around and meeting all of those state leaders and upgrading Vietnam's bilateral ties with many countries, he never used bamboo diplomacy in official terms. So, the way that he kept like intentionally avoid using bamboo diplomacy is interesting because it might signal something else. The way that he might see foreign policy as, other way, as other narrative instead of just bamboo diplomacy is also very interesting. And obviously, we can, talk about that later on. But potentially, those three areas that I find very fascinating if you look at the way that Vietnam has been doing in the past year.
Well, let's kind of get to those one by one. I mean, again, each of those could be an episode in themselves. So we'll try to do this with keeping time in mind. And this is also all come under. There was a phrase that stuck out to me a few months ago. I think from To Lam, but kind of heralding this as the start of Vietnam's era of national rise, which I guess a lot of this kind of may fall under that banner. But maybe we could get to that as it relates to these topics. But so I guess starting with the administrative restructuring. I mean, so yeah, as you mentioned, combining quite a few ministries, cutting the number of provinces just about in half. I think I saw the other day that over 100,000 civil servants have resigned as part of this restructuring and streamlining, which I think is about 5% of the civil servant workforce or something like that. So I know these sorts of things have been talked about for years, but went through kind of with striking speed, as you referenced at the start. We're kind of got used to things happening a bit slowly, and then suddenly, overnight, a few months ago, there were half the number of provinces. So, what was kind of the driving force behind this streamlining? And I mean, as you say, what's been the impact so far?
Well, I think if you look at the way that bureaucracy in Vietnam has been performing in the past 4 decades, I think it's an elephant in the room that bureaucracy in Vietnam is a little bit like bloated and it's quite overcrowded. And there has always been talk about how you can really reform the system and make the system work more efficiently and with less resources. But since early 90s, Vietnam has been implementing 3 rounds of administrative reforms with no success at all. So I mean, like
Mm.
it's really really been a big success of Tolam to even try doing so, and with such a short period of time. I think within 6 months he was able to halve the number of provinces in Vietnam. He was able to chop down 30% of ministries as well as the employees within such ministries, and it results in, I think, quite slim and on paper more efficient system. So obviously, I
Hmm.
think it's something, at least on paper, is very good rationale for Tolam to start doing things, because the things that, when he initiated the so-called era of national rights in last August, um, the his rationale is that if you want to move forward, first you have to, have very very slim bodies, not a fat body. You cannot run as fast as possible. So the first thing he wants to do is to try to trim down the bureaucracy, so that he would first have a more efficient body to work with, and second, he can save
Hmm.
more resources, for investing in infrastructure projects and other stuff. So that's the rationale that Tolom, I think, he's see in, reforming the system. The second thing is that I think it's very handy for him as well. You look at the way that when you reform, normally you would have, they would create a lot of vacancies for, inside the system, both at the local level and at the central level. So it's easier for him to maneuver the system and, install some of his most trusted aides into key positions, so that he can secure other reforms as well. Because the thing in Vietnam is that we are very familiar with the collective leadership system, which is good in terms of check and balance. But at the same time, when you have a collective leadership, no one really takes responsibility. And so, in order for you to really break fast with the system, you have to really have somebody you trust inside the system. So, when you initiate something very drastic reforms, you are assure that you will get enough support in the system for you to carry out the reform that is needed for moving the country forward. So that's the rationale of Tolam, both in terms of, the efficiency rationale and the political rationale. So now come to the implementation of the, of the streamlining revolution. I think it has, on paper it's good, but I think there are a few things that make the reform a little bit, perform under the, under kind of underperform in a way that, many people expect. First, is about the what I call the leadership carousel. In the way, if you look at the way that many provincial leaders and many heads of the ministries have been moving around so fast, so quick,
Hmm.
it means that, like, the people inside the system, they don't really know, who to be put at what position. So in a way, they are not really well prepared to really assemble all of those pieces in the new system, and that makes the system work not as efficiently, as expected. And that comes at a very unfortunate time, because this year, I think Vietnam also has been hit with one of the worst year ever in its history in terms of natural disasters, including flooding, including the drought, everything that needs a very coherent and very efficient local system. Now, because of the drastic reform, it obviously will have a lot of impacts on the way that the government deal with natural disasters as well, and that probably is very unfortunate for him. And second, related to that, I think it's also leads to some kind of like capacity trade-off, because in the short run, obviously, you cannot expect the system to work very smoothly in the first few months or
Hmm.
even first few years. So obviously, we're going to see a lot of transitional inefficiencies, from both the system itself. You see people from Vũng Tàu now, works for Ho Chi Minh City Council, and so they have to wake up, at 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning, travel 100 km from Vũng Tàu to Ho Chi Minh City and come back. It's obviously it's not really efficient. And
Hmm.
from businesses and from the people, they have to deal with a lot of, changing address and, changing the registrations and all of those stuff. I think add up to the frustration of the population when you carry out this reform. So now I think it's come to a very important question: is that with all of that in mind, it's very crucial for Tolom and his team to really convince the people at the party congress that actually this is something that, will be smoother now in the next couple of years. When the reform actually get up and running, the system will be very efficient and very well oiled, and then Vietnam will be well prepared to move forward to the next step. But obviously, it's a hard shell. It's not easy for him to convince.
Yeah, and I guess it's happening at the same time that there's a lot of new laws regarding taxation and things like that coming online, and there's this big push to get everyone on VN EID, the government app that in theory will help with prevent banking fraud and allow people to use more digital paperwork and identification instead of hard copies of forms and things like that. Which again, in theory, sounds like a good idea, but I guess all of this happening kind of at once. Hopefully we'll smooth things out in the future, but I know certainly I've talked to some people who have been frustrated by kind of just how much is happening and kind of the lack of clarity about some things. But yeah, we will certainly see. And then so I guess moving in maybe into the kind of the private sector shift, which I know continues to get a lot of attention, but certainly within my network, there was a lot of excitement around Resolution 68 when that was announced a few months ago. And again, still being discussed. And then there were a few other kind of related resolutions around the same time. And I think this one kind of marked at least a rhetorical shift in calling the private sector the driving force of the economy, whereas previously it was considered important, but kind of the state, was driving things. What do you make of Resolution 68 and kind of this shift, again, at least rhetorically, into talking about the importance of the private sector?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Even if you look at the way that even the core message of this of this resolution was being issued by the Politburo, I think was a big win for So Long, because you talk about the communist state in Vietnam, and obviously for a communist state, the state sector must remain the key pillar of the economy, and that has remained so in the past 4 decades of Vietnam's innovation um, reform policy. So I think it's very big win for Tolom to even convince his comrades that it's important to put down all of those ideological considerations, to put the private sector as the most important force of the economy. Because purely, if you look at the way that the private sector has been developing in Vietnam, it has been the biggest source of employment, has been biggest source of tax contribution. It has been so dynamic. So obviously, if you want to move forward, if you want to be at the same level with South Korea, Japan, and all those other Asian tigers in the 60s or 70s of the last century, you must put the private sector at the forefront of the economy. So that I think is very big shift, and I think it's very important for Tolom to do so. Um, at the same time, like you said, in Vietnam, being put on a resolution doesn't mean that all of those narratives will be translated into policies. And obviously, after Resolution 68, there has been a lot of pushback, even though implicitly from the conservative factions in Vietnam, most notably from the propaganda apparatus and from the military, on how you should continue to put the state sector as as a pillar of the economy. And there has been a lot of discussions about the need to issue a similar resolution for the state-owned enterprises, to basically compete with the Resolution 68 in in being the most important force of the economy. And because of that, you have when you read Resolution 68 and all those coverage from the state media, it's very interesting because the wording actually quite grammatically incorrect in Vietnamese. It's a một động lực quan trọng nhất, is a one most important driving force. It's basically make no sense in grammatical term, but basically it's kind of like a kind of like concession in the way that you still on paper you still consider the private sector as the most important, but basically is one most important, but so that leaves some room for other most important in quote unquote in the economy. So that's very interesting to see, and that I think is a very big issue for Tolam as well, because on the one hand he recognized that the private sector is the most dynamic and is the biggest contributor to Vietnam's economic growth. If Vietnam wants to even leave the middle income trap. On the other hand, there are also discussions about, whether because of that, Vietnam will actually, go off right, to of their socialist path, and that might create some big problem for Vietnam, similar to the way that the former Soviet Union was, was doing under Gorbachev. So that put him in very difficult position to really emphasize that narrative in policy discussion. And secondly, I think even though he recognized very correctly that the private sector is the most important driving force of Vietnam's economy, but when you have this the right diagnosis, it doesn't mean that you have the right solutions. So he really
Hmm.
wants to bring Vietnam private conglomerates to the level of Samsung or Hyundai or those chaeboons in South Korea. But at the same time, the Vietnamese political economy, is runs on different foundations compared to South Korea or Japan. So there's always a risk of first the clientism. So in a way that all of those private conglomerates actually they just jump into rent-seeking activities instead of just competing with each other and bringing all of those small and medium-sized enterprises up with them. And second, it's also about the how you can create a capital transference and a really accountable system so that all of those resources and all of those favors that you create to all of those private conglomerates actually work and actually not wasted like the way that the private state-led modernization program by former Prime Minister Nguyen Dinh in actually 20 years ago, 2006 and 2007. So he must make sure that all of those mistakes will not be repeated. So that's not very easy, especially when you look around, when he tried to do so many reforms at the same time. So that obviously will take a lot of efforts for him and his team to really figure out how to really make first to deal with all of those pushbacks from other factions inside the Vietnamese political elites about the role of the state sector, and second, how to really make a system work without wasting so much resources for Vietnam, so that the country can move forward.
Yeah, and I've seen some concerns, that this may end up kind of just benefiting a few of these big conglomerates you've mentioned. There is a huge, of course, those companies are important, but there is I don't know the number off the top of my head, but a huge part of the economy is kind of medium and small enterprises, mom and pop shops, household businesses. What do you make of the concerns that those smaller businesses may not really benefit from this, while really this is just going to be like create a few winners of the Vin groups, the Sun groups. I mean, I think some leaders have explicitly said they want national champion companies. So what would you say to those sorts of concerns floating around?
Yeah, I mean, like the actual wording of the resolution is good in terms of promoting both private conglomerates like Vin Group, like TNT or like Taco, and at the same time promote the development of SMEs in Vietnam as well, because it actually targets doubling the number of SMEs in Vietnam from now until 2030. So now I think we have like less than 1 million SMEs, and the Vietnamese government wants to double that to 2 million in 5 years. So actually, that's good in terms of the actual wording of the resolution. But obviously, it also mentions about creating 20 globally competitive conglomerates. So obviously, it risks having kind of like a jackfruit policy. So in the way, you have so many priorities. It's like jackfruits. So many priorities that you don't really know which actually is the real priorities. So that's probably the biggest concerns for SMEs and for people who really wants to see a more competitive and more more equal market economy in Vietnam. So that's the first that's first I would say tensions between the wording of the resolution and the actual implementation process. And secondly, I think it's also important to see if you look at the political economy of Vietnam, the policies mostly benefit those who with a very strong, very solid political connections. And obviously, SMEs they don't really have strong political connections like the private conglomerates, for better or for worse. So obviously, it's easier for all of those private companies to really lobby the policy makers to issue policies that actually more beneficial for them instead of for the SMEs. The way that Tolam and his team wants to see is that when he prioritizes resources to the private conglomerates, when they rise quickly, they also bring the SMEs under their wings, similar to the Japanese flying geese model. So in a way, you have the big, the big geese flying and then covering the small geese, and basically like every geese actually move forward in a
Hmm.
very synchronized way. But it's just a wishful thinking, and it's not easy to to implement in reality, especially when you look at the business landscape in Vietnam. We have many small and medium sized enterprises, and we have around 4 or 5 million household businesses, and many of them are not registered. So we have seen in this year there was a big effort by the government to basically force them to register as enterprises, and that created many chaos. On the streets in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, many restaurants and household businesses just stop working because they're so were so afraid of the tax collectors and of those new requirements. And I think it's even though the intention is good, but the way that is it being played out is not necessarily good equally. I think they need to really step back and to consider how to really combine prioritizing those private conglomerates in mega infrastructure projects, and at the same time to create a better business environment for SMEs to work and not being crowded out by both private conglomerates and SOEs. And that's not a very easy task for basically for anyone. It's not just for Tolam's team, but also for even for policymakers in Japan and South Korea when they created their own policies in the last century. So I think it could be very interesting to see how Tolam teams can balance all of those things out.
Yeah, and it has been fascinating to see the likes of Vingroup and Palco really embrace Resolution 68 and propose building the national high-speed rail line or metro lines. And there's been a long, an increasingly long list of projects that some of these companies have proposed taking on. Whether or not they'll be able to be determined. But I have for several years wondered why the private sector isn't or couldn't get more involved with metro lines or things like that, because they're all taking so long on the public side. But again, we'll see how that goes. And I mean, at the same time, they're also, of course, the state is still quite involved in the economy, and I found it interesting to see, Ministry of Public Security, for example, they're building a new airport outside of Hanoi, took control of Mobifone, and the Defense Ministry, of course, has Viatel, which is like one of the most innovative corporations in the country. So certainly, it's not like the state is backing away from that either.
Yeah, I think like really it's not really a good sign because the way the Vietnamese politics has been doing in the past 4 decades is that they try to restrict the access of the military and the police from intervening too much into the economy. Obviously, we have seen this phenomenon before, and actually, it's not good. So the police they have some good reasons to acquire mobile phone. They have good reason to acquire FPT. They have good reason to build a totally very fancy big airport. But I think that's not really a good sign when when the police and the military want to intervene too much into the economy, and I think there should be some kind of discussions about that policy in the next party congress, because it's important that even though when you talk about prioritizing mega projects to the private sector, when you want to bring the private sector as a forefront of the economy, but at the same time you allowing the basically a non-economic forces, security forces, to intervene too much into the economy, and that would create waste first, and second, that would might crowd out the influence of the private sector, including the foreign investment as well, because obviously you're not in a good position when you try to compete with the police, in acquiring a new project or having a new public investment. So I think it's important to have this kind of discussion that you have to at some point restrict the or set some kind of barrier so that the police and the military should know their positions. They're there to protect the country. They're there to protect the stability of the society, not to make profit. So it's very important to to remind them of their actual responsibility instead of letting them intervene too much into the economy.
Yeah, so let's maybe move into the foreign policy point we also mentioned at the start. So yeah, I mean, Total has undertaken a number of quite interesting trips. You wrote about this recently. I'll include the link in the show notes. He's visited several, I think, multiple European countries, North Korea, which I think raised a few eyebrows. China, of course, I think was the first overseas trip. I mean, there's quite a shift from Nguyen Phu Trong, who, I mean, of course, he was aging and not in good health, so not traveling abroad really. But I think even when he was healthier, it seems like the prime minister or president would take more of these sorts of state visits. So, yeah, what do you make of Lam kind of undertaking so many of these trips and some of the places he's decided to go?
I think ritually is Vietnam as a whole wants to legitimize the party rule as much as possible. So in a way, when the head of the party travel to other country and being received as a head of state, so it's in a way it's legitimizing Vietnamese politics and would avoid some complications later on. And in a way, that also fits well with Vietnam's four pillar system. So in a way, even though the party chief is considered as the first among equal, we're still being able to remain the system of presidency, prime minister, and national assembly without the need to merge the party chief and the presidency like what happened in China or in Laos. So that's I think that's visually that's good for Vietnamese politics overall. And secondly, I think for To Lam, I think he wants to be seen as a more proactive leader, not just a party leader, but also the state leader of Vietnam, traveling around
Hmm.
and building up a really strong and capable and confident image of a statesman. So in a way, it will help Tolam tremendously in presenting his vision at the party congress and also bringing more influence, in different capitals from Western capitals to to Beijing or to Moscow. So that I think that's the rationale behind the all of those. I think nearly 20 trips up to Lam in the past year, which is extraordinary if you look at the way that Nguyen Phu Trọng, carry out his foreign policy in since 2011. Third, at the same time, I think there is some risk as well because normally the Vietnamese system has been so balanced because people know their position and people knows the limits. So basically, in that system, you have very good division of labor. So the party chief normally just care about domestic politics, and if they ever travel, they just travel to some very important, foreign destinations like China or Moscow, but not so frequently. So that because the position of the president should be the one who take all of those ceremonial diplomatic activities. But now because Tolam takes so much responsibility in foreign policy, that leaves little space for President Lương Cường to actually travel. So I think if you look at the number of foreign trips that Lương Cường did this year, he's only traveling to around like 5 or 6 countries, and I wouldn't say those countries are are not important, but basically they are not really a big you know important destinations. Peru, Chile, and Laos. So I think that potentially would create some kind of tensions or even dissatisfaction within the system on the way that he sees the division of labor at the top leadership of Vietnam. And fourth, it is also very interesting to see, even though he travels so much, but Tolam never used bamboo diplomacy. So it's very interesting to see what kind of, let's say, a new botanical rhetoric that he wants to use for his new concept foreign policy. But from what I see is that I think Tolam wants to emphasize more the ever-growing confidence of Vietnam's foreign policy. So they're not just bamboo, swinging in the wind, but they actually has more foot stand in the regional order, and he believes that Vietnam can play a more constructive role in the at least in the regional affairs. And so that's very interesting to see, that from the perspective of, outside observers, because obviously when we're thinking about Vietnamese foreign policy, it's mostly related to bamboo diplomacy, and which actually now been a little bit obsolete with Tô Lâm.
Yeah. I guess I hadn't quite picked up on the kind of bamboo diplomacy phrasing disappearing a little bit. That is interesting, but yeah, I mean, certainly, I know a couple years ago the upgrade of the U.S. relationship to comprehensive strategic partnership was a big milestone, and now there's been, I think, at least half a dozen more of those.
Yeah, I think we have like
Yeah,
14,
so
14
that's been
CSPs, and
interesting.
it's remarkable. Yeah.
And yeah, and obviously Vietnam wants to be seen as a kind of a steady hand, especially obviously they're not anywhere near as big as the U.S., but given the unpredictability and kind of lack of trust that the U.S. has at the moment, they want to be seen as not not necessarily contributing to that. And so I guess maybe the last 5 to 10 minutes we should discuss the party congress again. It's been mentioned a few times, which is in January. Obviously, these nobody can predict what will happen at these things. It's very closed off to the public view, really. But I guess maybe for listeners who may be less familiar with what a party congress is, could you maybe kind of just describe what happens at one, and then I don't know what you maybe expect to see or what people should look out for in the preparations in the next few weeks.
Yeah, I think it's just a very brief understanding of what the party congress mean. Basically, Vietnam is a one party state, so basically the congress is the most consequential events in the country in every 5 years, because there, the elite members of Vietnam's political system will elect the 200 member central committee. So basically, a de facto parliament of Vietnam, and this central committee will elect the Politburo. So basically, around 17 members of the executive branch of the central committee who actually run the country. And they also elect the general secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam. So basically, the first among equal leader in the country, the position that Tô Lâm now retains. So I think it's very crucial for us to observe what happens in the Congress. First, because of the potential change in the personnel of the top leadership of the country, so similar to whatever elections happen in other countries. And second, it also signals the policy directions of the country in the next, at least in the next 5 years. And so that's very consequential for anyone who really interested in Vietnamese politics to observe. And what is interesting is that Vietnamese politics, even though we are one party, state, is has been extremely democratic inside the party. So the elections process
Mm-hmm.
inside the party is very democratic. And because of that, we don't really know what would happen. We don't really have a strong guess of who's going to lead what position, similar to what might happen in China, for example. Obviously before Xi Jinping, they know who's going to be the leader of the country 5 years before the party congress to pick that man. In Vietnam, it's normally would be always kind of like last minute surprises in every congress that I observe. The first congress I observed, I think, is 2006. So it's 20 years ago. And coming to the 2011, 2016, with the alleged rivalry between the late leader Nguyen Khac Giang and the former Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng. Coming to the 2021 with the extraordinary and unprecedented re-election of Nguyen Phu Trọng to the third term, which broke the party constitution, to now with a lot of surprises, I think, waiting ahead for us to see. So I think it's very, at least, as a hobby, it's interesting to see, to follow all the events by the party congress. And secondly, as a policy analyst, it's important to see who gonna lead, who gonna occupy the most important position, especially the party chief, the prime minister, and the National Assembly, and also what kind of policy directions the country will unveil in the next 5 years. Because this year has been a kaleidoscope in terms of policy changes and with new reforms being introduced. But what going to happen if something unexpected happen in the party congress, and whether we see the reforms will be continued or whether we're going to see new policy changes. All of these things will be played out at the Congress. So I think it's an extremely interesting event to follow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what should people kind of be looking for? I mean, obviously, Tolam has had one of the most consequential years in, I guess, recent Vietnamese history, at least. He presumably will want to continue that. I've seen some speculation about the defense minister potentially rising in terms of stature. I mean, both the defense and the public security ministries seem kind of, as referenced, seem kind of ascendant in terms of overall power, I guess, for lack of a better word. But I don't know. What do you kind of what should people be paying attention to in the next few weeks?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there could be the plenum, the 15, I think, well, potentially the 16 plenum, so to discuss about nominations in the party. So
Mm,
basically, the process would be that the this incumbent Bureau will nominate one or two members who gonna be introduced to central committee, whether they can be considered as a nomination to be voted in the party congress as a party chief. And so at the moment, I think even the people inside the system are not sure that who's is the leading contender for the position. Obviously, from
mm,
the political science point of view, if you are an incumbent and you have a lot of trusted aides, inside the system, and if you look at the way that the draft political report, which is the most important political document of the party congress being introduced with a lot of references to Tolam reform and to Tolam's narrative. I could put my bet on Tolam at this moment in terms of his very strong position to retain his general secretary position at the next party congress. But obviously, Tolam has just been there for a year. And secondly, if you look at the seniority within the system, I think Tolom is not, extremely senior compared to other members of the Politburo, including Defense Minister Phan Bang Giang or, President Lương Khương and other senior members, which is very different from the way that the General Secretary is compared to other members. When Phu Trọng, for example, was been there for 5 or 6 consecutive terms in the Politburo, and he was kept like a patriarch in the system, which make it easier for him to convince other members to to believe in him and to also to exert his authority over other members. But Tolam, before he was elected as a president and then general secretary last year. He was a police minister for his whole life,
hmm
working in MPS, and he didn't really have a lot of experience at the at central level, and he just been in the position in just a year. So basically, he doesn't really have really extremely high leverage compared to other members. Even though he's a basically he's a front runner, but he's not really very kind of like overpowers other members. So that's one point.
mm,
And secondly, if you look at all of those reforms that Tolam has been making in the country, on paper it's really good. On paper it has very strong rationale, but at the same time, like I mentioned about the inefficient, transitional inefficiencies, all of those, job loss from the state sector, the inconvenience of the restructuring at the provincial levels, the resentments of the people who lost their provinces, which is very strong in Vietnam because they really they're really emotional about about their province being disappear after the mergers, and all of those concerns about the role of the private sector inside the country and the direction of the country, that puts some pressure on Dolom as well. So it's not, it's when you create very, let's say, when you have this kind of like, a corrective instruction within the system. Some would benefit and some would lose. And so
hmm
basically, when you do some, kind of like disruptive reforms like Tolom is doing, he will have some enemies. So that would put more uncertainties over the result of the election as well. And I think for other factions, there is a good chance that they might not try to upset Tolam, but leverage all of those dissatisfactions and the disadvantages of the new system to have some concession of the way that the reform is being carried out in Vietnam. So potentially they would seek more, let's say, check and balance or accountability. So in the way that um, I would guess that the first position might still belong to Tolom and his team, but then other positions might be up to negotiation, so that Tolom would not have there's a leeway to do whatever he wants without strong checks and balance, without strong consultation from other factions.
Yeah, there'll certainly be plenty to pay attention to, and maybe perhaps we could have a conversation once all that is announced in January, late January, I think. Well, Zhang, thanks so much for taking some time to talk through these really meaty topics. I mean, there's so much we didn't even get to from this year, from the decision to resume pursuing nuclear energy. I found the two parades, military parades for the April 30th and September 2nd holidays to be really interesting, or anniversaries to be really interesting, and kind of some of the messaging around that was different from what I've seen here before, really. But anyway, really a momentous year, and I assume 2026 will kind of continue that. So thanks again for sharing your analysis. Like I said, I'll include some of your recent work in the show notes. But yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, thanks so much. Obviously, I don't think we did justice to cover all of those events in Vietnam last year, because it's so eventful. There's so many things to talk about. We can even do live streaming for hours to talk about that. But it has been great talking to you, and really appreciate that's just your time and effort in making the weekly podcast happen. And I think it has been a really tremendous year for you as well. And I really enjoyed your coverage.
Oh, well, thanks. I appreciate that. So yeah, thanks again. That's it for this episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. And don't forget to sign up to the Vietnam Weekly newsletter on Substack. I hope you have a wonderful holiday period, whatever you celebrate, and see you in 2026.